Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Bronftalk with Judy Batalion as everyone gets settled in. Really grateful that Judy, that you're joining us on Yom HaShoah and such a powerful book to discuss. So let me just introduce Judy. She's the author of The Light of Days, which was optioned by Steven Spielberg's Amblin Partners and will be published in 18 languages. Her first book, White Walls, a memoir about motherhood, daughterhood, and the mess in between, was optioned by Warner Brothers, for whom Judy is currently developing the TV series Cluttered. And Judy's essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Vogue. Judy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And as I was starting to tell you before, it was a really powerful way for me to sort of, as coming into this Yom HaShoah, to read this book, because as we were discussing the other day, I grew up in Montreal and you grew up in Montreal, and there's sort of a pervasiveness to the Holocaust story, and it felt like it's something, grandparents of survivors, and it felt like I knew sort of a lot of the stories and the types of stories that were told, and the story you tell that centers these incredible women's stories and just opens up so much more that I had no idea about, and there's so many interesting things to discuss, and so I guess the place to start is sort of how you felt when you first made this discovery of this book, that's a source material, and what it felt like to be sitting there with it.
Sure. So I guess I should explain that this whole project happened by accident. I'm not a scholar of the Holocaust, and I had never intended to write about this. I was living in London. Should I just tell the whole story, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll talk. This project began in 2007. I was living in London at the time, and I was really exploring issues around my Jewish identity. I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And at that time in my life, I was very interested in what I call the emotional legacy of the Holocaust, how trauma passed on through the generations. And my own life, I was thinking a lot about danger and how I both perceived and reacted to danger. I had trouble almost assessing what was really dangerous, what real threat or risks were. And I felt that had to do with my Holocaust heritage. And because of that, I decided to explore this in a performance piece. I was doing a lot of performance at the time. And I wanted to write about strong Jewish women who had confronted danger and to try to figure out what that meant for me too. So the first woman to come to mind was Chana Senesh, who I think you know, but just in case for anyone who doesn't, she was a young Hungarian Jew who before the war moved to what was then Palestine. And but during World War II decided she wanted to fight the Nazis, and she joined the Allied forces, became a paratrooper, went back to Nazi occupied Europe, and then she was caught. But legend has it that she, looked her executioners in the eye when they shot her. And I'd studied Chana Senesh in my Montreal Jewish day school in 5th grade. I remember it was a blue and white book we used to read every Friday. But we'd always studied Chana Senesh as the hero. And I was kind of interested in understanding Chana Senesh, the person. Like, who does that? Who volunteers to go back to Nazi-occupied Europe to fight the Nazis? What is that psychology? Who does that? And that's what brought me to the British Library. I decided to research Chana Senesh and see if there were sort of more nuanced biographies about her that I could draw on. There were not very many books about Chana Senesh at the British Library. So I just ordered whatever they had. I went to you have to pick up your stack of books at a counter. And when I picked it up, I noticed one of them was an unusual book. It was an older book. It was dusty and had a fabric kind of covering, and it was in Yiddish. It was called Frauen in die Ghettos, Women in the Ghettos. But of course, even more unusual than the book was the fact that I speak Yiddish. So also from my Montreal Jewish education. So I was able to read this book, and it was such I started flipping through looking for Chana Senesh, But in this 200-page book, she's maybe in the last 10, 15 pages. It's not about her. The book is about dozens of young Jewish women who fought the Nazis in Poland. And the chapter titles are things like ammunition, revenge weapons. There was an ode to guns. I mean, this was so unexpected. It really jolted me. It really stunned me. And I knew there was something special, something really stunning in this story. And that's where it all began 14 years ago.
Wow. Yeah. And it's I can't imagine sitting there in your hands with this book that sort of is the course of the next, over a decade. It's pretty incredible. I should mention, I didn't mention that I'd love to have as many questions as possible for Judy throughout this. So at any point, please do message me, and we'd love to get your questions in at any point. So definitely please do that. But it's a fascinating sort of, the way you talk about Hannah Senesh. There's a sort of model of being a hero that she embodies. And later in the book, you talk about sort of how she was selected in some ways, that she was not necessarily the only hero. And the book really opens up what female heroism looked like. But maybe you could just start by talking about sort of who what the other option between Hannah Senesh was, and sort of like, maybe that's a way in to start talking about some of these women.
So I guess in my book, which I should say, my book is not a translation of the Yiddish book. It was inspired by that original source material. And then I did a lot more research around that. But I really talk about a pretty wide range of women's resistance behavior in Poland. I really only focused on Poland. Jewish women, and I'm talking only about young Jewish women, and primarily I'm looking at women that came out of youth movements, and they had an organized resistance and organized fighting groups. But these women did all kinds, I always say it kind of spans the gamut. They were social workers in the sense they started soup kitchens, they took care of orphans, they did medical care, they clothed people, all of which was illegal. They also were writers of underground bulletins, editors of underground papers. They were blowing up Nazi supply trains. They were saboteurs. They were shooting assassins, shooting Gestapo men. They were guerrilla fighters in ghetto uprisings, again, using guns, flinging Molotov cocktails, using explosives. And then many of the women I write about were a particular role for women in the underground, they were called courier girls or keshariot, connectors. And these were young Jewish women who disguised themselves as Christian Poles. They were able to pass, and they often went through lengths to perform this role as Christian Poles, and then they slipped in and out of ghettos, and they delivered information. The ghettos had no radios, they had no newspapers. So these women, especially at the beginning of the war, they were they used to call them the human radios. They were a main information source for Jews in the ghettos of what was even going on in Poland. They were the ones bringing news about the Nazi plan and the genocide. And then their role kind of morphed as the underground developed into a militia itself. And they became smugglers of weapons, ammunition, explosives, fake IDs. They did a lot of work creating and bringing fake IDs. They transported money. Sorry, sirens outside. They transported money. They also did a lot of rescue work, taking Jews from slave labor camps and ghettos and finding them safe hiding spots or taking them to the forests. And they helped hide children. They helped negotiate with landlords or Polish people who were hiding Jews. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to some of the roles of what young Jewish women were doing as part of the organized resistance.
Yeah, there's a huge wide range, and a lot of the sort of roles you talk about are sort of these sort of glamorous is an awful word, the totally wrong word, but there's sort of these ideals we have of what heroism looks like. But I think there are also, you've talked about some of those roles where it was, I know there's one example you talk about later, like towards the middle of the book, about the one of the women who served was serving food and helped them organize a Hanukkah party, even though she was pretending she wasn't Jewish. So I guess I sort of wonder, like, what's the way that women sort of used their perceived, like, the fact of being women to allow them access to these kind of acts of bravery?
Right. So to do much of this work, you had to leave the ghetto. Not all of it. Some of it was done, especially the social work could be done inside the ghetto. But I mean, bringing information, smuggling weapons, doing any sabotage work, you had to leave the ghetto. And as I said, these were Jewish girls who disguised themselves to pass as Christian girls. And women were better suited, better able. It was easier for them to pass. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them is that they were not circumcised. So men had a physical marker on their body of their Jewishness, and this was used if you were suspected of being a Jew and you were a man, you were told at gunpoint to drop your pants. So women didn't have to endure that kind of threat. Women also, and in the 1930s in Poland, which, aside from amazing things I discovered in my research about the war, I also became very obsessed with the 1930s in Poland, because I had not realized what a strangely progressive and culturally rich time this was for Jewish culture. But Jewish women went to school. School was mandatory in Poland for boys and girls up to 8th grade. And many Jewish families sent their sons to private Jewish schools, yeshivas, other prep schools, but Jewish schools. But they often sent their daughters to public school. And because of that, these Jewish girls who were growing up in the 30s, who became the resistance operatives who I write about in the war, they studied alongside Catholic Poles. They were aware of Catholic custom, the religion, the mannerisms, the different ways of speaking. And look at me here, they knew not to gesticulate. That was considered a very Jewish thing. One of them writes about she had to wear a muff to hide her hand movement as part of her disguise. But importantly, what these women learn, and they talk about this time and time again in their memoirs and testimonies, is that they learned to speak Polish like a Pole, not with, as they put it, the creaky Yiddish accent. They spoke a good Polish. So because of all these things, they were better able to pass. And were more suited to do this work. Yeah, sorry.
And there's like a really striking example of that you tell, where there's one of these women who's passing as Catholic and has to go to church, and it's this, like, she knows peripherally because she's been in school, but to actually have to sit for her first mass. I don't know if you want to tell a little bit about that story, what that was like for her.
I mean, these were there were a few stories like that. And, she made sure to sit behind a Catholic who she knows is really Catholic, and to really just copy everything they did. I mean, and all the customs, and taking the wafer at the right time, and the drink at the right time, and the genuflection. And it was, these were life and death acting jobs, and any little thing could give it away.
Yeah, and it's uncomfortable to be in a service like that you're not familiar with in any context, but this is like obviously a life and death scenario. And so you can imagine being that age and being thrust into it. It's pretty incredible.
And in that particular story, these women use this technique. One of them even called it was like aggressive confidence. So in that story, the young Jewish woman had actually told, she was undercover working. Many of them got jobs working as housekeepers for Germans during the day. And she told them that she was desperate to go to church. She was upset that they weren't getting her a dress to go to church. And she really wanted to go to church because they played it up so that you would never assume that they were Jewish. An important part was being confident and fearless, which were non-Jewish traits.
Right. And as they sort of, you talk about this fearlessness and this like sort of actorly ability they develop, and you also sort of highlight the sort of toll that takes, like to witness all of these sort of horrors of the Holocaust from the lens of not being able to react in any way like a Jew, to have to sort of seem cavalier about it. Is there anything like sort of it stands out to you about sort of the trauma of that aspect?
I mean, there are stories of women that had just witnessed their friends, their families being brutally murdered. And then they would get on a train posing as a Pole and, you know, overhear people laughing about killing Jews and people killing Jews. And they would have to laugh along. They couldn't let it slip for a second.
Yeah, it's incredible. Linda is asking, I don't know, Linda, if you're on video, if you want to jump in with your question, if you're there, otherwise I can ask, but if you're there, I want to jump in. It's a great question. Okay, so otherwise, is Linda there? Okay, so I'll just ask the question then. And so in the future, if for people who post their questions, let me know if you want to ask it or not, and then I'll go to you, or I could just ask it. So Linda's asking about how women work together with men in coordinating the resistance.
That's a great question. And, you know, it didn't come up that much I was working from testimonies, I was working from diaries. Mostly they were things written in either the 1940s or the 1990s. And the relationship with men in the resistance, there were a couple of cases. There was one woman in her diary. She was upset that, you know, she felt like she was really a leader of the group in Krakow. And when they didn't include her in some of the big decision-making meetings, that upset her. But aside from that, I mean, it really felt like they were working together in, I mean, really desperate situations. And, you know, everyone did what they could. And if this role was what women were good at and what they could do, they were those who did it, they became, I read one account, they were almost competitive with each other, taking on more and more difficult tasks because this really gave them meaning.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. There's a story, and I think you deal a lot with this, but the way women use sex to sort of get out of situations in a lot of cases, and sometimes we're able to do it in a way where it felt like I'm trying to think how to phrase it, but that they were in control of their agency in those cases. And I guess I don't think that's exactly right. So maybe if you want to phrase it better, but that sort of tension.
I think it's a little bit like what I was saying before, the extreme confidence. And a lot of that was using their feminine wiles to do that. So for instance, one of these couriers, her name was Lanka Kazabrodska. I mean, just an incredible person and story. And she would have had a valise full of guns. And her technique was she would go up to Gestapo men and be like, oh, this is so heavy. Can you carry it for me? In a kind of using her flirtation. She was very beautiful apparently, and using these female traits to get the Gestapo to carry the guns, so that they wouldn't suspect her, they wouldn't search her bag. So this happened a lot.
Yeah, there's one of the most striking was to me was after she was being one of the women you talk about was being searched by a Nazi, and then she. I kind of want to let you, if you know, do you know what the situation where I'll tell you a little bit more about this, where she kind of smiles meekly as she leaves after she sort of does something to so that no one. She basically, I mean, I'll just tell the story now. But there was you'll fill in anything I get wrong, but she somehow basically kills a Nazi and has to pretend that she was meekly, you know, smiling to other Nazis as she left, that she was let out. So like sort of that sort of tension is fascinating to hear you talk about.
She would pretend to be a young Polish girl. Her name was Nusha Teitelbaum. She was in her 20s. She had a history degree from Warsaw University. Wow. Many of them were very educated. This is going back to my obsession with the 30s in Poland. And she would pretend to be a teenager. She would braid her hair, put in a kerchief. In this one case you're talking about, I think she was kind of pretending to be pregnant, or they thought she was pregnant. She went to Susha, which was the Gestapo headquarters in Warsaw. I was like, I need to speak to this and this Gestapo man. And they thought she was a pregnant peasant girl going to tell him she's pregnant, she's in trouble. They felt bad for her. She's very pretty. They let her in. She goes in the office. She pulls out a gun, shoots him in the head, and then walks out and waves goodbye. And her nickname was Little Wanda with the braids, and she was on she was on every Gestapo most wanted list. She
Wow.
went, I mean, she did this work repeatedly.
That epitomizes fearlessness.
I have a question.
Sure.
Is it okay to just ask one?
Absolutely okay, but in the future, would love for you to just ask you for the future. Everyone just sort of post it in and say, let me know if you want to ask it yourself or not, but definitely
Okay.
Go ahead. Whoever, I can't see that is, but go ahead.
My question is, did some of these women, did their parents know what they were doing? And did you find any research on the relationships between their brothers or their parents or fathers or anything? I mean, I imagine some of them might have not had family too or whatever, but just wondering how that was looked upon by the close relations of these people.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this also goes back to the 1930s. And keep in mind, I write about a number of different women, so the stories are different. Not everyone's situation is the same. So for some of them in the 30s, when they joined their youth movements, many of them actually, they would leave their family home to go live in kibbutzim. There were kibbutzim, I didn't know this, all over Poland. And they were all kinds of communal living arrangements. And there was a lot of tension there because often parents were upset that their child was leaving them for a socialist kibbutz that was taking over from the family, really from the family. These youth movements were their whole lives. They were spiritual, intellectual, social, emotional training grounds. And so in the war, when the war began, many of the people I write about, they were already living with their youth movement. There was like kibbutzim in the ghettos already. And so there was always a bit of tension around that. Some of the families were, I remember one woman was telling me, her daughter was telling me that her mother had given her the blessing and said, go and fight. And she felt that because of that, her mother felt her mother had survived, and for the rest of her life felt okay somehow about having left her family to join. This was in the Vilna underground. Whereas there are other stories of parents who were very upset that their children left them, and this haunted the child who then grew up and later in life always kind of haunted them that they had left their parents. Most of the women I write about, their parents were killed. The reason they were alive, either they had dodged death in some way or because they were young, and young Jews were often taken for slave labor. But their parents were in their 40s and 50s, and they were often killed.
And it seems to me that sort of like one of the themes you kept, in framing the book, you keep coming back to the question of fight or flight. And it seems to me that something about the way to sort of deal with that trauma in those scenarios was just the way to keep somehow moving through it. And as soon as they sort of got stuck, that was where.
Well, also there were some, just even going off that, the becoming an orphan was a catalyst for many of them. It was one partisan woman, she had said, when my mother died, that's when I said it's time to fight. They were kind of unhinged. Their normal life structure didn't exist anymore. Nothing made sense. And that also brought them to the underground and they were furious. They were furious. The testimonies and memoirs, especially written in this time, they're not sad. They're angry. They're so furious with what's happening and with how unjust and horrible this is. And that fuels them as well.
Interesting. And that's, I guess you're saying that's the sample of people who became, of women who became resistance fighters. Like, presumably others were, despondent and despaired, but among the people who were resistance fighters, they were fueled by an anger, is what you're saying.
I don't have that many people who were writing in the war, so there are only a few, 2 or 3 memoirs or diaries that I had access to that were actually like from 44, 45, and yeah, those 3. They're written with fury. Yeah.
And I don't know, so on one hand, as we were saying before, there was a way in which women were able to use sex as a sort of tool and that was sort of a way for them to get supplies or to help, whether it's just like flirting, as we were discussing before, or that, as you were sort of going over. But one of the real risks was sort of, and you tell a few really harrowing stories of sort of the sexual abuse women would encounter from being out in the world, and it seeming like whether they were uncovered and seeming, how much of a sort of, how much of an awareness of that risk did they have, and what was sort of your reflections in working through that?
I mean, my sense was they were definitely aware of this risk. I read a number of stories. There was this, they were called schmaltzovniks, or blackmailers, greasers. Schmaltz means grease. And they were usually Polish people who could tell who was passing as a Pole, but was really Jewish. Apparently, the Germans and German soldiers couldn't really tell. They were foreign. They didn't have as nuanced a sense of who was Jewish or not. But the schmaltzovniks would blackmail people and say, if you don't pay me, 2,000 zloty, I'm turning you into the Gestapo. And they would get rewards for turning in Jews. And for women, so women used to go out with a pot like money right here that they would just give out to the schmaltzovniks because they knew they were going to be blackmailed. And there are a number of stories of close encounters. But the schmaltzovniks also blackmailed women for sex. And it was, come back to my room with me now, or I'm going to give you up to the Gestapo. And this is something women had to, they certainly knew about this and had to negotiate this. And there's one amazing story. I don't want to give too much away because you have to make you buy the book. But, she's on a mission and she finds herself in this situation, and the guy brings her back to the apartment, and in like a moment where he's fighting with his like roommate, she jumps out the window and, hides in his garden while he's like comes and tries to find her, but he's drunk and he can't find her, and then she just moves on and continues on the mission. So
yeah, it just seemed like that sort of, they just had a general awareness that was one of the threats that they just had to keep dealing with.
Yeah.
And it's something that I definitely never really you would hear about it in general, but to hear those specific stories are pretty harrowing. And one of the things that's very striking is that once we get towards the end of the war and liberation happens, it's obviously that brings about its own set of challenges. Is that something that you could sort of talk about?
Yeah, so I should say that the last part of the book is entirely takes place after the war. I was extremely interested in understanding how the women who did survive, how they kept on surviving. How did they go on after this, after experiencing so much trauma and then risking everything in these most dramatic, threatening fights with Nazis? And how did they move on and cope for the rest of their lives? And most of these women that I write about, when the war was over, they were 22, 23. They had their whole lives ahead of them. And they'd also missed out on the time in life when one trains for a career or meets your partner, or, they missed out on that kind of really crucial college years, for better of a comparison. And so I was very interested in that. But I think, Adam, what you're asking about is there's an assumption that, the day, when towns are liberated, cities are liberated, there should be these champagne in the streets affairs. But for many of these women, they write about it as being the worst day of their lives, because at least in the war, as fighters, they were either living this performance, they were fighting, they were with a group. They were, even if this group didn't even know they were Jewish, sometimes that happened in partisan detachments. A woman pretended throughout, she was sabotaging trains with them and pretending to be Christian for years. So, people, but they had an organized life. The fight gave them purpose. And when the war was over, that fight was over, and they had nothing. They had no family, no homes, no nationality, and were filled with traumatic memories. And now they have to start over. And for many of them, it was, a low point of their lives. And also
Yeah.
the whole world that they'd known before the war didn't exist anymore. That their country didn't even exist anymore. So it was an extremely difficult time at the end of war.
Yeah, and that really came through in a fascinating way. By the way, in terms of questions, I see we have two great questions from both Eva and Marnina that I want to get to, but can you guys just both message me and let me know if I should come to you next or if I'll just read your question. So either way, we'd love to include both those questions. Sort of on that note of after liberation, what sort of changed in the approach? Like, is there something you can say in terms of how these women thought of themselves, or how they reoriented their, what was sort of the next steps in sort of rebuilding things after that in terms of their sort of finding movement to move through the world?
I mean, again, I write about different women, so different people had different mechanisms. For many of them, it was writing. That writing was an important part of the process. They wrote their stories, some privately, some were published, and then felt they were able to move on after that. I don't know. Yeah. I feel like you always have. I'm like, Adam, you tell the anecdote. Was there something in particular you were thinking of?
Well, I mean, I guess, we'll get to this more because these are good questions that I think will draw this out. But sort of this distinction I was interested in, where it seemed like some of these women that you profile were taking on sort of more danger in their lives, and then I don't know. My read is that the way it sort of felt like they had to sort of renegotiate how to present more as a like there was less danger and there was less sort of a more female acceptable sort of existence in the normal world. I don't know if you agree with that, or if but that was sort of just one of the thoughts that I had in reading the difference after liberation.
I mean, I think that, I mean, I'm thinking they're different examples. So some women went to live on kibbutzim in Israel and had their own struggles trying to fit in there with communities who are not survivors. And many of them did marry, and it was very important for them to have children. And I think that was a big part of the moving on. It was so important to start fresh and create their family anew.
And take on, and I saw in a lot of these cases, and I think those struck me where they sort of took up on these traditional roles. It seemed like that's how they sort of gained stability, whereas others sort of struggled more sort of after. I mean, it's hard to imagine how you recover after that, but that was just sort of my observation from the story, some of those stories you told. I don't know if that sounds, if there's.
But actually, I see what you're saying. But many of them took on caring roles and caring professions. But I think that was part of their youth movement training. They were socialists, collectivists, and this is what I think giving is actually what got them through the war and helping others and rescuing. And so many of them became either humanitarian workers, social workers, health workers, nursery teachers, refugee aid. Many of them went to work now because there was I think giving and feeling empathy actually helped them recover.
That's fascinating. And it's something that maybe in some ways they held on to. They didn't have to suppress as much, even through the most dangerous parts. Like they still had to sort of hold on to that, like even if as an actor, like maybe that was sort of the reason that.
Excuse me. Hi, do you have these in a 10?
Okay, I think that was not a question. So this is actually, so I think this brings up to an interesting point that you raised in the book about sort of the different, maybe we could actually Mark, if who's helping out with some of the tech, maybe we could make sure that people are muted by default in case we just have any more advice. But yeah, there's these different narratives that sort of emerge after the Holocaust that we're all familiar with. And this is sort of something that you reflect on how these narratives came to be. And so I think this is maybe a good place to bring in a couple of the questions, but Eva, do you want to jump in with your question?
Yeah, I just had a question. I think one of the things that generally sits on me when I sort of think about just the Holocaust and and when I think about what would I have done, I guess, or is this kind of question of you know, like the framing like victims of the Holocaust as like victims versus like as people who could fight back. And like I always think of like, you know, where is the sort of on the spectrum of agency, like where do people fall, and like how does, you know, I guess like what kind of level of I guess protection could you give yourself? And so I was just wondering if like your thoughts on that changed as a result of like seeing these like truly amazing, like almost, you know, like otherworldly stories, if your like perspective on, I guess, like just like the pure like resilience and will of you know, victims changed.
I think it changed my perspective of the Holocaust narrative entirely. I think what was so, I wasn't consciously someone who had what they call the myth of Jewish passivity. It's not something I thought about consciously. My own grandparents survived the Holocaust and they fled, which was very an active thing to do. But the narratives or the tone of the story for me had always been like the people hid or fled. And even though I knew that, and actually hiding and fleeing are both very active, their activities, but the tone, something about the tone of the narrative of the Holocaust stayed to me. Like everything felt solid and like it wasn't, stayed, I think is the word I'll stick with. And I think when I first read this Yiddish book, what really struck me, obviously the content of the narratives, but also there was so much movement. These stories were so alive. These people were active the whole time. These are stories of people jumping off moving trains, you know, dyeing their hair, going out to buy clothing that they could wear, finding a guy in a cemetery to buy guns from, physically walking. I mean, there's so much activity and life. And that for me also just changed the tone of the whole story. And, you know, now when I look at this story of the Holocaust, or at least I mean, to me now it's entirely a story of resistance and resilience. The whole story is one of defiance. Just most people were killed because they were dealing with a massively armed military, but people defied in different ways, but constantly. So I think that's how my perception was changed.
That's really, that's what interested me too, how you sort of dealt with that in the book. And I think it's, that was a fascinating answer. I think one of the interesting things about that is that there's a way in which these stories sort of open up more than just the sort of specific stories you're telling, and sort of break down the entire option of passive or active or you know, fight or flight, but it just shows sort of the range of responses that was possible. And sort of this gets to Linda's question, who's asking about how museums and memorials about the Shoah sort of what their response was to some of these stories, which was, in short, obviously they weren't being promoted actively. But sort of there are sort of different, like one of the women who's telling her story in Israel has sort of reluctant response from the audience, or I don't know, Rude, I'll let you describe it. But yeah, the Holocaust lands very differently in America and Israel, and there are different narratives being constructed around it. So if we can talk a little bit about that.
Big questions. I like it. I like it when you're giving answers. I'm going to take you with me on all these Zooms. So first of all, many museums do have Holocaust museums do have sections on resistance. I actually found a lot of information in museums. Many of the testimonies and memoirs that I used in my research were published. They were published often by museums, by small presses. So it's not that nobody knows this story. It's that the story sort of stayed in the kind of museum specialist or academic realm. I'm talking about Holocaust museums. So most Holocaust museums, yes, they'll have like one section on the resistance. It is part of the story. And yes, again, it was a very important source for me. But then there are, in Israel, interestingly, a number of the youth movements started their museums in Israel about the Holocaust, and these are very much dedicated to resistance. So there is a ghetto fighters house in Israel, a huge resource for me, with an amazing picture library, amazing archive. There are 32 photos in my book of these women. I could have had 3,200. I mean, the Ghetto Fighters House has some amazing source material. Yad Vashem also has quite a bit on resistance, and I found many testimonies there. But Yad Vashem wasn't from the youth movement. Sorry, the Ghetto Fighters House. Then there's Moreshet, which is Hashomer Hatzair. The Ghetto Fighters House is Dror. There's Hanoar Tzioni, has their own place called Masua. And these are their Holocaust museums. By the way, these groups were fighting in the 1930s. They were disagreeing in the ghetto, and they're like still disagreeing today about this story. And that's even within like the, socialist Zionist movement. So sorry, I'm not sure if I'm answering clearly. What I'm saying is that many Holocaust museums do have sections on resistance, and that these stories, and that there are museums of resistance even in Israel. But the story never kind of made it out of there.
And just to sort of give the book its full credit, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, Judy. Maybe some of these women are included in some of these exhibits, but generally speaking, these exhibits haven't focused on the story of ever before of women as resistance fighters.
Well, so like Moreshet has an exhibit on women fighters. It's like in a basement. I came there. You have to get an appointment. It's in the north. These aren't like hugely they're mostly education centers. And they did have an exhibit on women in the resistance, but the work is generally, when people talk about women in the resistance, it's usually almost encyclopedic. So there's like one entry on her for 50 words, and her for 50 words, and her for 50 words. And I believe I'm very grateful for this research. It helped me tremendously. But there's no narrative story of not just women, of Jewish resistance in Poland. There's no overall sort of chronological story of what happened. It's not like there's a general book about Jewish resistance in Poland, and I'm saying, oh, well, you forgot about the women, let me add that in. There is no, that book doesn't exist. There are amazing books about certain ghettos, biographies, encyclopedias, focused studies, but because I was writing about a movement across Poland, my first draft, it took me 6 months, was basically making a timeline, like a second grade timeline, like, oh, this happened. Oh, and then they went to Vilna. Oh, and I'm building this timeline up from memoirs and testimonies. So I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I remember her story when she went from Vilna. Oh, that happened then. Oh, that happened. So I had to create the kind of overall chronology of the story too.
Yeah, and it's like one of the striking sort of things that stood out to me is there's one of the women who, incredible, like has done such incredible sort of things during the war, finds herself in Israel in a kibbutz, and they're basically people are more interested in dance that's happening, and she starts hearing that there's like a dance next door, and so I sort of wonder how like what do you think in a broader sense this narrative that you're telling and really putting together tells of the sort of the American, and I think it's pushing against both of these reductive sort of American victimhood narrative in Israel, resiliency narratives, but like what does it sort of offer between those?
I mean, what does it offer between passivity and resilience?
Like, I mean, in other words, yes, maybe I didn't phrase that exactly right. I mean, I think you open up sort of an interesting question or an interesting lens of there are, Jews who are righteous among, there were righteous among Gentiles who were very interested in celebrating, but we weren't as interested in celebrating Jews who saved people, who saved Jews the same way. So I guess I mean, by sort of like breaking down these two narrative options, how like do you think we should look at the Holocaust story, where it's not one or the other, but it's a little bit more sort of gray, but still somehow a narrative?
I mean, I feel like because I'm coming from, I'm not a Holocaust scholar. I'm a historian of art. So I'm not a Holocaust scholar. And so I come to this story from personal memoirs. I built this out of personal testimonies and memoirs. And I'm writing about very different people who had very different lives and personalities and experiences. And you know, I think that's, the Holocaust is a very complex story of a story of millions of people. And, you know, even in people will ask me, well, what happened in the ghettos in, you know, how did people get food in the ghettos or something? There were 400 ghettos just in Poland. There were more than 400 ghettos. And these ghettos were each very different. And some of them were, and this had to do with the local Nazi rulers. It had to do with the local, who was in the Judenrat, who was running the Jewish community. It had to do with the physical landscape. Some ghettos were in the middle of nowhere. Some were urban centers. And all these factors changed what each ghetto was like in terms of how people were able to resist or fight back or do anything. So I think throughout my work, I've had to be so, it's also nuanced, it's also complicated. And if anything, I hope maybe cerebrally, if people take away from this, is the fact that, you know, these histories are of course complex and constructed, and we need to think about that and just be aware of that.
Yeah, and on a similar sort of, I wonder if this is, it sort of struck me, you were talking about sort of the time you spent in Poland and hearing the story on one hand of Poland trying to come to terms with its involvement in the Holocaust, and then there's a sort of cynical interpretation of why they're doing that, and there's obviously those who don't think that who don't see Poles as victims. So sort of like, do you think there's more space to have that conversation? Is that a sort of conversation that we should have in a more nuanced way than we've previously engaged with?
I always think we should have more nuanced conversations. So yes, I think every conversation is worthwhile. You know, Poland, I mean, my thoughts and relationship to Poland is a whole other hour Zoom session. And I do talk a little bit about this at the end of the book, but, you know, on the one hand, here's a country that's making laws about how to talk about the Holocaust. I mean, there have been headlines recently about scholars here who are in trouble with Polish law. And on the other hand, the people that I worked with in Poland, mostly young people who are helping me as drivers, translators, fixers, my publisher in Poland, journalists, curators at museums. I mean, they were so passionate about this story. Some of them, they were like, you don't even have to pay me. And I was like, no, I'm paying you. You spent a day driving me through these crazy towns. They would show up with, like, they had done their own research. For me, I didn't ask, I was like, oh, I just hired you to be a translator. There was a they seemed very passionate. To them, this is also really part of their history too. This is part of Polish history. In fact, an article came out in a Polish newspaper about a week or two ago after I had written a piece about this in the New York Times. And this article was responding to that and saying, how come we don't know about Nusha Teitelbaum? And they went and researched, like, why in Poland the story of this girl, the one who had the braids and the kerchief and pretended to be pregnant and shot the Gestapo man. And this article is about how she was a communist. She was affiliated with the communist youth movement. And right now in Poland, people don't like communists. I mean, I'm generalizing, but, you know, people are reeling from years of Soviet rule. And so they're not celebrating the communists' history. So there are different political factors that go into this. And I do talk about this a bit more in the book. Yeah, and it's not always the sort of, there's a sort of easy way to dismiss some of what we hear from, I mean, it's hard to hear regardless, but there's an easy way to categorize it that I think the way you lay it out makes it a little bit more complicated than the sort of easy sort of, no, they're trying to hold on to the past, or no, they're good. They're trying to, you know, resolve the issues of their past. It's definitely somewhere between those two, it seems. So now we find ourselves at this place where we're seeing in sort of
most of our personal lives. We're sort of getting to the end of this experience of COVID, and you were finishing this book during COVID, and I know you've been sort of reflecting a little bit on that. And I think Marnina has a great question that ties into that. If you want to jump into that, Marnina.
Thanks. Yeah, this is so amazing. Thank you both so much for doing this. Yeah, well, I was just really struck, Judy, by like your relationship to fear and like danger, perceived danger that you mentioned at the beginning, because I feel like I'm very afraid of danger and getting hurt. And like, that's been very present for me in terms of like my relationship to like resistance that I want to be part of, and like how I can show up as an activist. And I'm curious how writing this changed your relationship to fear or danger.
Yes, that's the $1 million question. You know, it would be simple to I could say, yes, I'm no longer fearful. These women have inspired me, and now I am all courage. And that's not true. But, you know, I do think I have taken from these stories strength and inspiration, and even things like, even just what I was saying before, how for some of them, you know, to cope, their strength was in helping others. Some people didn't go and shoot Nazis in the head, but they helped orphans read books. And that was really meaningful and important and powerful for them. And, you know, I think we all come to social action in a way that makes sense for us. And, you know, I wrote a little piece about this in the Globe and Mail, I think last week. Was I just talking about this? No.
No, Canada's paper of record, I should say.
Yes, Canada's paper of record, about how these stories had kind of helped me during COVID. Just, you know, I mean, it's been a very difficult pandemic. Of course, nothing as difficult as what they went through, but that's why I kind of look to them for some solace or some instruction. And, you know, it was, you know, every time I would think of their story, of the patience. I mean, the war, COVID, this has been 1 year. The war was 6 years. And then getting out of the war was years. And, you know, I've taken from their stories, their patience, their resilience, their empathy, their continued compassion. Even in the worst times, as I was saying, many of them turned to be giving and to teach compassion and justice. I think those perhaps helped me a bit. And you know, in the end, I'm in New York, and when COVID hit, you know, should we leave? Should we not leave? And my husband's British, and I always say he's all blitz to my blints. And, you know, he was like, we're staying put. We're, you know, hunkering down. And this went against my like, get out of here. But we did stay. And you know, I can't say it's because of these women, but I thought about these women too. Like, sometimes you can stay and it's okay. And I hope that it maybe taught my children that sometimes you can stay. And even though all their friends left, we stayed, and we are okay for now. So.
Yeah, and it's like, it's amazing because the sort of it says like, it almost says like leaving feels like you're doing the more active thing, but as you put it, like it takes bravery to sometimes do things that don't always, you know, externally, like, you know, staying in one place can be, as it was in New York during the peak, is brave. It's certainly brave.
There are options. There are options, and there are different ways to react to dangerous situations. And I think that's what I learned, that we can,
right.
You know, it's not always, I was always a runner before. And in many ways, I still am a runner, but, you know, it's kind of learning I don't always have to be a runner.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's fascinating. So we have time for one more question, and so Eva has a last question to help us wrap up again.
Thank you again. I had a question. I saw that like Steven Spielberg wants to like do something with the book. My question was, like, these stories, like it seems to me like that makes sense. Like this like really should be a movie, like totally. My only wonder is like, do you feel at all concerned that like just the pure kind of like superhero-ishness of it, or like the kind of like sort of, you know, like badass parts of it might be like accentuated, or kind of like, you know, that like that will be, it'll be shown as like, oh, these like, you know, these like heroic girls, and that will kind of overshine like the broader story of, you know, the Holocaust and like the sort of the nuance of, you know, like of this like the bravery of it, I guess.
I'm not sure if you're asking if I'm afraid that, because something that I've been very afraid of is by writing about resistance, you make the Holocaust seem like it wasn't that bad. Is that what you're asking? Because that's, and that's a phrase I take someone, she wrote a brilliant book about humor in the Holocaust. And she started it by saying this, you know, I'm worried about writing it because if I'm writing about humor and laughter, it makes it seem like it's not that bad. And in a world right now where so many people don't even know what the Holocaust is, I agree. I think we have to be very sensitive to make sure that the story, you know, that by right, I don't want to make it seem like there was an army of Jews fighting the Nazis, because that wasn't the story. These were starving teenagers who were freedom fighters. So if that's what you're saying, then yes, I am actually a co-writer on the screenplay, so I have some input, though, you know, if it does move forward, there's so many different people involved in these kind of projects, so who knows. And
hopefully and it's a fascinating question, and hopefully you're in good hands with, he has a pretty good track record with making, with, you know, I don't think, you know, the point he even raises about like a Disney sort of version of this is, I could imagine that being terrible, but I think he has a pretty good track record when it comes to reflecting on this period. So I think that's sort of, to wrap up, I just want to thank Judy again. And we'll put a link to her book in the chat as well. The book is, as you'll see, sort of, you know, perfectly strikes the balance between telling these stories and not being, there we go. There's the book.
Also, there's a children's edition that also came out this week, and it's for ages 10 to 14. So if you teach middle school or have a middle schooler, it's a good companion book.
It's great. So yes, so yes, those are the two book options. We'll send out a link, and just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you again, Judy, so much for having this talk with us.
Thank you so much for having me on. Thank you.
Absolutely, my friend.